Throughout history, women who found themselves on the wrong side of the law, or simply the wrong side of society, were subjected to some of the most brutal, bizarre, and downright ridiculous punishments imaginable. Whether it was being accused of witchcraft, stepping outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, women often bore the brunt of harsh and cruel consequences. But as strange as it may seem, these punishments weren't just about maintaining law and order. They were also about reinforcing power, control, and a heavy dose of superstition. From medieval contraptions that would make modern torture devices look like children's toys, to punishments that seem more like absurd pranks than justice. Societies around the world came up with some truly over-the-top ways to keep women in line. But as brutal as they were, some of these punishments also revealed just how creative or crazy people could be when it came to enforcing social norms. The scolds bridle. The scolds bridle, a device that encased a woman's head in iron and gagged her mouth, was specifically designed to silence women. This form of punishment became prevalent in England, Scotland, and Wales during the 16th and 17th centuries. The punishment was primarily targeted at scolds, women who were seen as excessively talkative, critical, or quarrelsome, especially toward men. However, its use was not limited to nagging wives. Women who spoke against the established social order or resisted male authority were also subjected to this cruel punishment. The scolds bridle first appeared in England during the reign of Henry VIII, although it quickly spread across other parts of Britain. The punishment reflects the broader context of the period, a society marked by a rigid hierarchical order that placed women firmly under male authority. At a time when religious and civil laws were deeply intertwined, speaking out against authority could be interpreted as heresy or insubordination. As such, the scold's bridle was not just a physical tool of suppression, but a symbol of the patriarchal control exerted over women's speech and actions. While the scold's bridle was not always written into legal codes, its use was socially sanctioned and became part of the customary law in many towns. Town officials or even neighbors could accuse a woman of being a scold, which would result in her being publicly humiliated by being forced to wear the bridle. The gag often included a small spike or blade that was pressed against the tongue, making any attempt to speak painful. In some cases, women were paraded through the streets, further adding to their humiliation. The scold's bridle was rooted in the deep-seated belief that women were inherently subordinate to men, and that a woman's primary virtue was her silence and obedience. In early modern England, it was believed that women who spoke out of turn undermined their husband's authority, and, by extension, the social order. This punishment served as a tool to enforce gender norms and keep women in their socially prescribed roles. The very term scold had negative connotations, implying that a woman who dared to voice her opinions or criticize a man was inherently disobedient and unworthy of respect. While records of personal accounts are scarce, there are documented cases where women were forced to wear the scold's bridle. One such account comes from 16th century Scotland, where a woman named Janet Forsyth was sentenced to wear the bridle for unseemly brawling with her husband. Forsyth's punishment reflected the societal expectation that a woman's role was to submit to her husband's authority, and any challenge to this could result in brutal retribution. Witch hunts and burnings. Perhaps the most notorious period in European history for its treatment of women came during the era of witch hunts, which stretched from the late 15th century until the early 18th century. Fueled by religious extremism, superstition, and societal upheaval, thousands of women were accused of witchcraft and subjected to brutal punishments, including torture, hanging, and burning at the stake. Witch hunts arose in a period of significant social and religious turmoil, particularly during the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Religious authorities played a significant role in propagating the fear of witches, who were often blamed for unexplained misfortunes such as crop failures, disease, or the death of livestock. The Church's condemnation of witches was rooted in the belief that they had made pacts with the devil and were capable of causing harm through supernatural means. While men were also accused of witchcraft, the vast majority of victims were women, particularly older women, widows, or those who lived on the fringes of society. Women were considered more susceptible to the devil's temptations, reflecting deep-rooted misogyny in both religious and secular thought. These ideas were reinforced by influential texts like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written by Heinrich Kramer in 1487, which explicitly targeted women as being more likely to engage in witchcraft due to their perceived weakness and moral failings. The trials of suspected witches were brutal and often involved torturous methods to extract confessions. One common method was the swimming test, in which the accused woman was bound and thrown into a body of water. If she floated, it was considered proof that she was a witch, as it was believed that the water would reject her. If she sank, she was innocent, but often drowned as a result. Another common method was the pricking test, where officials would search for the witch's mark, believed to be a sign of the devil. The accused woman's body was pricked with needles, and if any area did not bleed, it was taken as evidence of witchcraft. These methods were not only physically painful, but deeply humiliating, as the accused were often stripped naked and examined in front of their accusers. For those found guilty, the punishments were severe. Many were hanged, while others were burned alive at the stake. In countries like England and Scotland, hanging was the preferred method of execution, while burning was more common in continental Europe, particularly in Germany, France, and Switzerland. Witch hunts disproportionately targeted women due to the prevailing belief that women were inherently more prone to sin and susceptible to the devil's influence. Women who defied societal norms, those who were outspoken, unmarried, or independent, were particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. In many cases, accusations were driven by personal vendettas, economic competition, or social jealousy. Women who were healers, midwives, or herbalists were often viewed with suspicion, as their knowledge of plants and medicine could easily be framed as witchcraft. These women, who were often invaluable members of their communities, became scapegoats for societal anxieties during periods of famine, disease, or political instability. The Salem witch trials of 1692 are perhaps the most famous example of a witch hunt, but they were part of a broader pattern of persecution. In Germany, which saw some of the largest witch hunts, tens of thousands of women were executed over several decades. One infamous case was the Würzburg witch trials of 1626 to 1631, where over 900 people, the majority of them women, were burned at the stake. In Scotland, the North Berwick witch trials of 1590 saw several women accused of trying to kill King James VI through sorcery. Agnes Sampson, one of the accused, was subjected to brutal torture before being strangled and burned. Footbinding. The practice of footbinding in China, which lasted for nearly 1,000 years, represents one of the most extreme forms of physical mutilation inflicted on women in the name of beauty and social status. The custom began during the Song dynasty around the 11th century BC and persisted into the 20th century, affecting millions of women and leaving a profound impact on Chinese culture. Footbinding is believed to have originated in the imperial court during the reign of Emperor Li Yu, whose favorite concubine was said to have bound her feet to perform a dance for him. The practice soon spread among the elite, becoming a status symbol that signified wealth, refinement, and beauty. Small feet, or lotus feet, became a highly prized physical attribute, and women with bound feet were considered more desirable in marriage. Over time, footbinding became a rite of passage for young girls, typically starting between the ages of 4 and 7. The process involved tightly wrapping the feet with cloth, breaking the bones, and forcing the toes under the sole of the foot. The goal was to achieve a foot length of about 3 inches, which was considered the ideal. The process of footbinding was excruciatingly painful and often led to lifelong health problems. The bones in the feet were intentionally broken, and the toes were bent under the sole, causing severe deformities. Infections were common, and many girls lost toes or developed gangrene. Walking was difficult, and women with bound feet often required assistance to move around, effectively confining them to their homes. The pain of footbinding was not limited to the physical realm. It also had psychological and emotional consequences. Girls were subjected to this practice at a young age, often under pressure from their families, who believed that bound feet would improve their marriage prospects. The practice reinforced the idea that a woman's worth was tied to her appearance and her ability to conform to societal expectations, even at the cost of her physical well-being. Footbinding was not merely a physical practice, it was deeply intertwined with Chinese social and cultural norms. Bound feet were seen as a mark of femininity and virtue, and women with large, unbound feet were often viewed as unfeminine or lower class. The practice was particularly prevalent among the elite, where bound feet were a symbol of wealth and status, as it indicated that a woman did not need to work or move around independently. For many women, footbinding was a way to secure a favorable marriage, as men from wealthy families often sought wives with small feet. However, this came at the cost of their autonomy and freedom. Women with bound feet were often dependent on their husbands and families for support, reinforcing the patriarchal structure of Chinese society. While footbinding was widely practiced for centuries, there were always voices of opposition. Some scholars and officials criticized the practice as barbaric and harmful to women's health. However, it was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that significant efforts were made to abolish footbinding. The rise of Western influence in China, along with the efforts of reformers and Christian missionaries, led to a growing movement against footbinding. Anti-footbinding societies were formed, and by the early 20th century, the practice was officially banned. However, it persisted in some rural areas until the 1940s. The legacy of footbinding is still felt in China today, both in terms of its cultural impact and the physical consequences for the women who underwent the practice. Many elderly women with bound feet lived well into the 20th century, and their stories serve as a reminder of the extreme lengths to which societies have gone to control women's bodies. Stoning. Stoning, or lapidation, is one of the most brutal forms of execution, historically used to punish women accused of adultery or other sexual transgressions. This form of punishment has been practiced in various parts of the Middle East and is deeply rooted in both religious and cultural traditions. Stoning has its origins in religious texts, including the Bible and the Quran, where it is prescribed as a punishment for adultery and other sexual sins. In the Islamic tradition, stoning is known as rajm and is mentioned in hadiths, sayings and actions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. However, it is important to note that stoning is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran, and its use has been a matter of debate among Islamic scholars. In ancient Jewish law, stoning was also used as a punishment for various crimes, including blasphemy, idolatry, and adultery. The Bible contains several references to stoning, including the story of the woman caught in adultery, who was brought before Jesus for judgment. The act of stoning is designed to be both a physically painful and humiliating experience. The condemned person is typically buried up to their chest or waist in the ground, leaving their head and upper body exposed. A group of people, often members of the community, are then tasked with throwing stones at the condemned until they die. The stones used are usually of medium size, large enough to cause injury, but small enough to ensure a slow and agonizing death. The aim is not to kill the person quickly, but to prolong their suffering, making stoning one of the most excruciating forms of execution. While both men and women can be subjected to stoning, women have historically been disproportionately targeted. This is largely due to the fact that accusations of adultery or sexual misconduct are more frequently leveled against women, often with little evidence. In many cases, women who are raped or otherwise sexually assaulted are accused of adultery and sentenced to death by stoning. While stoning is no longer widely practiced, it still occurs in some countries that follow strict interpretations of Islamic law. In countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and parts of Nigeria, stoning remains a legal punishment for adultery and other sexual crimes. Human rights organizations have condemned the practice, calling it a violation of international human rights standards. One of the most high-profile cases in recent years was that of Amina Lawal, a Nigerian woman sentenced to death by stoning in 2002 for having a child out of wedlock. Her case sparked international outrage and led to a global campaign for her release. Ultimately, Lawal's sentence was overturned, but her case highlighted the continued use of stoning as a punishment for women in some parts of the world. Chastity belts. The chastity belt is a device that has long been associated with medieval Europe, often as a tool used to control women's sexuality. Though some historians question the widespread use of chastity belts, they remain a powerful symbol of the lengths to which society went to ensure the sexual purity and subjugation of women. Whether mythical or real, the chastity belt represents a dark chapter in the history of gender oppression. The idea of the chastity belt dates back to the medieval period, with most references placing its use in the 14th and 15th centuries, particularly during the Crusades. The story goes that knights who went off to fight in the Holy Land would lock their wives or betrothed in chastity belts to ensure their fidelity during their absence. These belts were typically made of metal and designed to be locked around a woman's waist, with only a small opening for necessary bodily functions. The implication was that the woman could not engage in any form of sexual activity without her husband's consent. However, recent historical analysis suggests that the widespread use of chastity belts may be more myth than reality. Many of the belts that have survived in museums were likely created during the Renaissance or later periods, often as novelty items or for the purposes of erotic art rather than practical use. Nevertheless, the very existence of such devices reflects the deeply ingrained attitudes toward women's sexuality in medieval Europe. Whether or not chastity belts were widely used, the concept itself is significant for what it represents. The idea that a woman's sexual purity was something that needed to be guarded and controlled, often by male authority figures. In medieval society, a woman's value was closely tied to her virginity and chastity, and any suspicion of infidelity could ruin her reputation or lead to severe punishment. The chastity belt symbolizes the extreme lengths to which patriarchal societies have gone to control female sexuality. Women were seen as the property of their fathers or husbands, and their sexual behavior was tightly regulated to ensure that inheritance lines remained uncontested and family honor remained intact. The concept of the chastity belt illustrates the broader societal belief that women could not be trusted with their own bodies and that male control was necessary to maintain social order. Although there are references to chastity belts in medieval literature and art, historians have debated the extent to which they were actually used in everyday life. Some suggest that the more graphic representations of chastity belts, with sharp spikes and complex locking mechanisms, were likely exaggerated or created for satirical purposes. For example, in the 19th century, chastity belts were often depicted in literature as relics of a more barbaric and repressive age, used to highlight the supposed progress of modernity. In this context, the chastity belt became more of a cautionary tale about the dangers of repressing women's sexual autonomy rather than a literal account of medieval practices. Even if chastity belts were not widely used in medieval Europe, the cultural impact of the concept has endured. The cucking and ducking stools. The cucking and ducking stools were forms of public punishment and humiliation, primarily used on women who were accused of being scolds or engaging in inappropriate behavior, such as gossiping, nagging, or slander. These punishments were designed not only to cause physical discomfort, but also to publicly shame women who were seen as challenging the established social order. The cucking stool was a wooden chair on which the accused woman was forced to sit, often placed in a prominent location in town for public viewing. The woman would be paraded through the streets or placed in a central location where she would be subject to the ridicule and mockery of her neighbors. This form of punishment was commonly used in England during the 16th and 17th centuries and eventually made its way to colonial America, where it was similarly employed. The ducking stool, a more severe variant, involved tying the accused woman to the chair and repeatedly dunking her into a body of water, such as a river or pond. This practice was particularly dangerous, as the repeated submersion could lead to drowning or hypothermia. Like the cucking stool, the ducking stool was used to punish women who were perceived as being overly talkative or who had caused social disruption through their behavior. In a deeply patriarchal society, where a woman's role was largely defined by her ability to remain quiet, submissive, and obedient, the cucking and ducking stools were effective tools for reinforcing these expectations. Women who stepped outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior, whether by gossiping, challenging male authority, or otherwise asserting themselves, were often labeled as scolds and subjected to these humiliating punishments. The use of these punishments was particularly prevalent in small towns and villages, where maintaining social harmony and order was paramount. Accusations of scolding were often brought by husbands or male neighbors who believed that a woman's behavior had disrupted the peace of the community. In this context, the cucking and ducking stools functioned as both a physical and symbolic means of reasserting male dominance. One of the most famous accounts of the ducking stool comes from the case of Anne Henley, a woman from Virginia who was sentenced to be ducked in 1751 for allegedly scolding and quarreling. Henley's punishment involved being tied to a chair and ducked into a nearby river multiple times in front of a crowd of onlookers. Her case illustrates the public nature of the punishment, as well as the dangers it posed to the accused. Other historical records from England and colonial America contain similar accounts of women being punished in this way, often for offenses as minor as spreading rumors or speaking out of turn. In many cases, the punishment was not just about the individual woman's behavior, but also about reinforcing societal norms that required women to be silent and subservient. The cucking and ducking stools were more than just physical punishments. They were also powerful tools of social control. By subjecting women to public humiliation, these punishments sent a clear message about the consequences of defying gender roles and challenging male authority. The public spectacle of the punishment ensured that other women in the community would be deterred from engaging in similar behavior.